students to drive all the way up here. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. All right. This is where we ended last time. Any questions from you lot? Oh, maybe I should turn on the this. My online students see it. I think they might see it. Hold on, let me see if they might not. They might not see anything. Actually, I don't even know. I hope that this isn't being duplicated. Crud. Okay, yeah, no, they are seeing what they're supposed to say. I don't even know what's happening right now. Hold on. Display settings. Extend. Yeah, no, they're getting what they're supposed to get. Cool. So they're seeing more than you guys. All right, great. Victory. All right. More people. Morning. Last name? Harrison. Okay, just making sure. Okay. So, now that this is up, any questions about what we've done so far? Cool. All right, let's move on into more stuff. So, we ended last time with the Cuban War for Independence going okay for Cuba, and then we decided to stick our noses into it. That we wanted to aid in Cuban independence so that we could have a say in what Cuba is like after the war, because we didn't want an independent nation in the Caribbean without our say-so, especially not an independent nation being run by brown people, because there's no better way to say it than that. There was, of course, the yellow journalism of the New York World and New York Journal, which, while they did cover Spanish atrocities, they also made some up to just get everybody really on board with this. The thing that finally really got it going was the destruction of the Maine, which, as I've said, was very unlikely to be caused by Spain, because why would they antagonize America when they were already losing to the Cuban rebels? It doesn't make any sense. Last name M. Stone. Okay, making sure. Make sure I get everybody in here. Okay, only a few people left. All right. Guam, which we haven't really talked about. Right. And as I said, the main explosion likely as far as I remember from some stuff that I've read about this, the explosion happened from inside the ship. It's very unlikely that the Spanish are able to turn invisible and sneak into the ship and then blow it up from inside. Pretty sure that some kind of spark ignited the powder that's used to arm the cannons, because, well, the explosion occurred in the powder room, and static discharges happen. Also, sailors like to smoke, and sometimes they like to smoke in the powder room because their commanding officers don't often check in there. And again, having worked with a lot of ex-Navy guys aren't especially smart a lot of the time. So that very well may be what happened. Not to speak ill of the dead, but I will speak ill of the dead. They probably goofed. But we blamed it on Spain because we really wanted a war. So, in going to war with Spain, McKinley signaled these imperialistic notions that have been building since we started this chapter, because After the war began, he worked on the annexation of Hawaii, which we also had mentioned, where Hawaii was overthrown by some plantation owners and the Marines that were stationed there. Because they felt like it, they decided they could make more money by annexing Hawaii than just having good relations with the monarchy there. And it was good that the rebels had already done most of the fighting, because the U.S. Army was kind of shit back then. We only had about 30,000 men ready to fight. This was before we had 80% of the national budget in the military. I'm exaggerating a bit, but, you know. McKinley mobilized about 200,000 National Guard and a bunch of volunteers. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, which were also volunteers. So again, the most famous group in the Spanish-American War were also just volunteers. Also, Americans weren't really ready to fight in Cuba. The whole, hold on one second, here we go, okay. The whole disease killing the Spanish also killed a lot of Americans. Well, before even that, they didn't have battle experience. We haven't fought a war since the Civil War, so it's been, what, a good 30 years. Uniforms were not suited for the hot, humid climate, and were not immune to the tropical diseases. So tropical disease, doesn't care who you are, it's going to kill you, unless you've lived there your entire life. And if you're still alive, that means you have developed a resistance to it. Tropical disease still kills natives of the region. If you're alive, you just happen to be the survivors of the disease and therefore have developed an immunity. There's lots of dead children that are the ones that weren't so lucky. Also, because we're talking about America, there are racial tensions, because of course there were. So I'm going to read this from the book. Let's see. As more and more black troops arrived in southern ports for deployment to Cuba, because, you know, Cuba's right there, so head to the south to deploy. They faced increasingly hostile crowds, angered at the presence of armed African troops gathered. Armed African troops. Yeah, armed African American men in uniform. In Tampa, Florida, where troops gathered from all over the country to be transported to Cuba, racial tensions exploded on the afternoon of June 8th. On June 8th, intoxicated white soldiers from Ohio grabbed a 2-year-old black boy from his mother and used him for target practice, shooting a bullet through his shirt sleeve. In retaliation, African-American soldiers stormed into the streets and exchanged gunfire with whites, leaving 3 whites and 27 black soldiers wounded. Reporting the story of this riot, the Atlanta Constitution denounced the wild and demonic conduct of the, I will say, black regulars, completely ignoring the behavior of the white troops that started the whole thing. Undaunted, black troops went on to distinguish themselves on Cuban battlefields because we're all people, regardless of what the Atlanta Constitution is going to say. So yeah, you know, grab a black child, shoot at him, the black troops get pissed about it, and then they get blamed for everything. Boy, that sounds about as American as you're going to get. So despite all these difficulties, the war was over in 4 months. 460 Americans died in battle, and more than 5,000 died due to disease. Because again, this is like late 1800s, early 1900s. Disease is still like the primary factor in wartime deaths. Secretary of State John Hay called the hostilities a splendid little war. Because, you know, it was pretty short. We didn't really lose that many men, relatively speaking. we won. We were victorious over Spain. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. and recognized the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, which we'll get to in a minute. Yeah, everything's great. Close the book on that, no problems. So here we have Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. I like that this illustration of Roosevelt is less cartoonish than the photograph I showed you guys last chapter. Like the photograph of Roosevelt standing with his men looks more like a cartoon than this cartoon of Roosevelt charging up the hill. Like he looks more like a regular dude here than he did in the actual photograph. Here we have American troops assaulting a Spanish, I guess a fort, but apparently a number of Americans have already made it to the top of the fort and raised a flag, even though the Spanish are still here. So, yeah, it's just showing you how overwhelmed the Spanish were. Because they were already losing. We just showed up to kick them and claim victory. There is the black battalions, which of course were segregated, because of course. And I showed you guys this before. This is of course afterwards when Roosevelt ran with McKinley, and the American flag has not been planted on foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake, which, you know, no. We'll get to that. I also like how, which we'll get to in a minute, it's specifically saying American rule in Cuba, although we're really careful not to say we're ruling over Cuba, but we clearly were saying we're ruling over Cuba here. Here we have another political cartoon. John Bull, which, again, if you haven't been paying attention, that's Britain. It's really most extraordinary what training will do. Why, only the other day I thought that man unable to support himself, and that is obviously America holding up these various lands that we have very aggressively taken and treating them like a circus act, and they're a very, very racist circus act. So, what about Cuba? Well, we said before how before the war started, Congress said that Cuba would be independent, but only after it was pacified. This was the Teller Amendment. McKinley and supporters insisted Cuba would have self-rule, but only after pacification. And pacification does not stop at when we kick Spain out. That's very open to interpretation, and that is on purpose. That's the thing about laws and acts and declarations and stuff. If you ever, like, you hear about a law and people are upset about it and you read it, it's like, I don't understand what the problem is. It's because it can be read different ways. Interpretation is 99% of the law. Again, this isn't a law class, but I'm just giving you that little bit of wisdom. Interpretation is very important. Oh, hey, look, more racism. Due to racial prejudice, Americans were blind to how much the Cuban rebels had actually put into the fight, which is to say, like, a conservative estimate, 90%. I would say, like, 99% of the fight. White commanding officers who arrived in Cuba were shocked at the number of Afro-Cubans in commanding leadership positions. Because, you know, you can't have that. We just had a war over whether they should be even people or not. So here's a quote. And this isn't a, like, private conversation that got leaked. This isn't something that somebody wrote in a letter that was meant to be sent to, like, another person that got out, and it was sent to the newspapers. This was an officer reporting to the New York Times to be read to everyone because this was the sentiment of the day. So he's talking about the typical Cuban he encountered, not the Spanish they were fighting, the Cubans they were going to free, ostensibly. The typical Cuban I encountered was a treacherous, lying, cowardly, thieving, worthless, half-breed mongrel, born of a mongrel spawn of Spain, crossed upon the fetches of darkest Africa and aboriginal America. That's what they thought about the Cubans. The typical Cuban. Not even like the ones that were secretly out to, like, take advantage of the chaos of Cuba, which were certainly what a lot of people thought was going on. So, because the U.S. officials believed that Cuba was not fit for self-rule, it was under military occupation until 1902. So, we helped them, and again, help is doing a lot of lifting. We went in at the end of the war and like pretended like we did anything. We died of disease a lot. It's mostly what we did. And then we occupied them. I told my Tuesday, Thursday class, this would be like if in our war for independence, we were beating the British on our own, and then France comes in right at the end, helps us out a little bit, and then demands that we do what they say and puts us under military occupation. And there's nothing we can do about it because they're so much stronger than either us or Britain. Yeah, there'd be some resentment there, I feel like. Like there was resentment towards France even after what they did, because there was like 2 years after the war ended before we even had our peace treaty, because the French, which were a monarchical power, didn't really like our idea of like a self-governing democracy, republic, whatever. And they didn't really respect American officials. But that was it. Like, they sort of turned their noses up at us. This is outright military occupation. They forced Cuba to adopt a governing document based on the U.S. Constitution, with further strings attached. The Platt Amendment in 1901 limited Cuban sovereignty. So Cuba was allowed self-rule, sort of. Cuba could not sign foreign treaties without U.S. consent. America could intervene in Cuba to preserve independence and remove threats to economic stability, and also Cuba leased Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. as a naval base. I'll get to that in just a second. So, U.S. occupation ended in 1901, and all of this means that Cuba is a protectorate. So they're sort of technically independent within their own borders, but if they try to do anything on the world stage, they have to go through the U.S. To give the easiest analogy, I would need to make sure that that my sound is properly streaming. Hold on. Okay. To give the easiest possible analogy, we were treating a country like a child. Like, okay, you can do your own thing in this little box, but if you want to talk to anybody else, you have to go through us. This country where the people had fought and died for years for their independence, we rolled in and said, no, you guys can't do this. You can't handle it yourselves. Also, you might recognize a certain naval base here. So initially it was because we wanted a naval base in the Mediterranean, Caribbean. For some reason, I get those mixed up. The Caribbean, which is all well and good, until some lawmakers decided that that would be a great loophole, because if we have a base or any sort of operation zone that's not in the U.S., that's not on U.S. soil, it's no longer under U.S. jurisdiction, and we don't have to follow U.S. laws. And that's where all the torture happens. In Guantanamo Bay, there's one in El Salvador. There are quite a few over in Iraq where we would just like grab people off the street and they disappear, and we would torture them to death because they look like they might be dangerous. But don't worry, we're the good guys. Anyway, here we have American Army of Occupation entering the suburbs of Havana. Havana, of course, being the capital of Cuba. So this isn't the Liberation Army, this is the Occupation Army. We're replacing Spain. We're not removing Spain, we're just putting American boots on the Cuban necks. Again, it's seen as very positive on the U.S. side. We got Cuba, we got Puerto Rico, we got the Philippine Islands, we got the Sandwich Islands, we got a couple of other islands in the Pacific. Just sort of overall. Here is another one of the weird, like Taft as a maid. I'm very sorry. Also, here's this horrifying little baby Teddy Roosevelt as the policies. I don't know. Also, Wilson's here. Wilson, I think, was the he was some higher up in the administration, despite being like the opposite party. So he was there, which then he eventually became president. This is a perfect illustration, and being Puck, I'm not sure how positively they view this. Puck tends to be a bit more of a progressive magazine. So here we have the first steps alone, and we've got Cuba here as a child, taking their steps with America here, Colombia overlooking, with protectorate around their belt, because they're not truly alone. We can, at any time, yank them back and reassert our control. There we have prosperity at home, prestige abroad, commerce, civilization, etc. Again, sort of going back to my European history class, we were talking about prestige colonies, which was essentially just, hey, look, we can put our flag in other parts of the world that aren't ours, therefore we're one of the big boys now. That's all prestige is. Like, it's not even, we're going to use this country, we're going to use this foreign land to make money. It's not really making us money, it's just showing that we can do it too. Which was pretty much all Germany had by the time Germany got involved in imperialism. Here again we have this view of America as like this savior of Cuba, saving Cuba from its own people, I guess, because the Cuban people were like the U.S. officer said, lying, thieving, treacherous, etc. And it says here, save me from my friends, because apparently the people who freed Cuba from the Spanish were going to destroy Cuba. All right. So, that was terrible. It gets worse. It gets significantly worse. Let's talk about the Philippines. Those of you that know about the Philippines, or at least have some idea about the Philippines, have an idea of where we're going. Those of you that don't, pay attention. So, before we even invaded Cuba, after the whole Maine thing, and we declared war on Spain, the Pacific Fleet was, well, over in the Pacific, and we decided to just go ahead and hit the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey attacked and destroyed the Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay on May 1st, killing nearly 4,000 Spanish sailors and leaving only 8 Americans with minor injuries. I'm wondering how you manage that. Like, how does one get a minor injury in, like, a major naval battle? Did the gun get too hot and he burned his hands, so he, like, had to go in and get the nurse to put bandages on his hands? Like, what does a minor injury look like in a naval war at this era? Maybe a cannonball hit nearby and he got splinters or something? Anyway, 2.5 months later, American forces invaded Manila proper. By the way, Manila is the capital of the Philippines, so it's like the main island. The Philippines, if you can tell from the name, are a bunch of islands. So they invaded Manila proper, and the Spanish forces just surrendered. There was no real big war against the Spanish in the Philippines. We wiped them out in Manila Bay, and then when we landed, the ground forces surrendered because, well, they just were not ready for a ground war with the Americans. So, with Spain defeated in the Philippines, we're not still fighting them in Cuba. We're getting ready to fight them in Cuba. Imperialists wanted to annex the Philippines as a staging post to exploit China, which I'll get more into that in just a little bit. I showed you guys that map last time of like how far west the Philippines are, which is to say they're so far west they're really far east. Oh, that's right. Yeah, cause, there was somebody talking about Alaska, and it's the furthest north state, west state, and technically east state in America because it crosses the what's that line called? The International Date Line. So it's technically the furthest east state as it wraps around the world. So yeah, the Aleutian Islands are weird. Anyway, yeah, so it's way over there. Obviously, racial reasoning was part of this. There was the belief that the Filipino people could not govern themselves. Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge said, "We must not forget that in dealing with the Filipinos, we deal with children." It's the same idea as with the Cubans and with a lot of what we're going to be seeing going forward. And this wasn't a strictly American thing. This was how Western Europeans viewed all of this imperialistic expansion. Either they're barbarous mongrels that need to be put down or put in a cage, or they're children that have to be guided by the light of civilization of the Anglo-Saxon race. So neither's very good. This one's at least pretending to be benevolent. However, not everybody was on board with this. We had folks like Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and the labor organizer Samuel Gompers, who created the Anti-Imperialist League. Now, needless to say, these arguments were vast within the League. They believed, for example, this violated America's anti-colonialist heritage because, well, we started as a colony and we threw off a colonizing empire. So why would we become a colonizing empire? That doesn't make sense. 2, economic concerns. So, as again I told my class on Thursday, Andrew Carnegie does not have a soul. He doesn't care about like the people living there. or America's anti-colonialist heritage. He doesn't care, but he feels like it's an economic drain on America, therefore it's not good. Carnegie doesn't care. Jane Addams, I feel like Mark Twain probably had a soul based on his writing. He at least believed people were important, and a labor organizer certainly cared about the workers. So I'd say they were probably more on board with the importance of the people and the legacy of America. Also, and unfortunately the book doesn't go into great detail here, but I'll be showing you guys a video at the end. Unfortunately, I can't show it right now because online, but I will show you guys at the end, and I, of course, will put the link to the video on Blackboard for my online students. The Filipinos did not want the Americans there. According to the video I'll be showing you guys, there had actually been an independence movement happening before America had shown up, and they were, similar to Cuba, had been fighting against the Spanish, and so America showed up and oh, cool, they're going to help us defeat the Spanish. And then America decided to annex the Philippines, and the Filipinos were like, ha, no. And so they fought for years. And America, being a much more powerful nation, murdered a lot of Filipinos. We're looking at least 200,000 Filipino civilians were killed, lots of mass graves. Again, the video will get more into it, but we're talking concentration camps that the civilians were put into. If you refused to go into the concentration camp, you were considered an insurrectionist and shot. And if you were found outside of a concentration camp, you were considered an insurrectionist and shot. There were instances of American commanders just being like, hey, every boy on this island that's old enough to carry a gun, he's an insurrectionist, kill him. It was genocide level stuff. Now the book says, so between 1899 and 1902, by July 1901, the Philippines were in American holding. And the book says that's pretty much where it ends, except it didn't. The war continued, the fighting continued until about 1913. Until our war in Afghanistan, this was our longest war. Because they did not want us there. And it took until us pretty much cornering the last of the insurrectionists in basically a crater and killing them to the last man to finally put this down. And the Philippines is largely what ended our imperialistic notions as a nation, because it lasted so long. Well, I say ended our imperialistic notions back then, because some people know what history is. But we'll see where things go. So here we have the Battle of Manila Bay, which was more of a duck shoot, it seems to me. The Spanish didn't stand much of a chance. Look at the way these ships look now. They're steam power. They've got moving turrets. This was a wild time for naval combat. Not quite World War I era dreadnoughts yet. So here's some of the jungle fighting in the Philippines. Again, considering where the Philippines are, this was basically Vietnam. Here we have the Senate Philippine bill offers great inducements to the bad Filipino. So you've got the bad Filipino as this subhuman, caveman, essentially. And then the good Filipino as these much more civilized, still very racially drawn, more human-looking people. Here's a lovely mass grave. Americans just dug a hole and dumped the civilians and insurrectionists alike into it. Here's a lovely water torture method. Apparently we picked it up from the Spanish. This is just using a piece of bamboo to hold the mouth open. Apparently another way of doing it was using a piece of bamboo and just like using it as a funnel and pouring the water down. And they either told us what we wanted to hear or they drowned. Violent outbreak at Tondo. Fierce and sudden onslaught upon the Americans. Repulsed with great slaughter. In one yard in which a photograph was taken, there were found no less than 20 dead. Yeah, Americans had machine guns at this point. Yeah, I believe the Maxim gun was a thing by now. Here is a horrendous, this is an execution device. The garrote. They put the person's neck in there and they turned it until it choked them to death. Not a very fast method of execution. But that's the point. You're torturing them until they die. Like, this is us being the civilized nation. Here we are. So, lucky Filipinos. It appears the Filipinos have lost confidence in Americans. Do the benighted wretches fail to realize what we have accomplished in their islands? We may have burnt certain villages, destroyed considerable property, and incidentally slaughtered a few thousand of their sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, etc. But what did they expect? Were we to transport an army more than halfway around the earth merely to listen to peace propositions? Not much. And look at Manila. 2 years ago, the main street of Manila did not possess a single saloon. Now there are 13 in this one street. On this one street. And they complain that drunken American soldiers insult the native women. By the way, insult was an old euphemism for, I'll just say assault. And what do they expect from a drunken soldier anyway? Progress is now in the islands. She may be red-handed and at times drunk, but she is there for business. Yep. And here we have, like, this is the specter of famine. Because we burned a lot of their crops, too. Like, the whole concentration camp thing. Like, once all the people were concentrated into certain zones, we burned all the stuff around them so that the insurrectionists wouldn't have any food. And then once we deemed the area safe, we just let the people out, and they starved. So yeah, I'll get to the video on that in just a little bit. But like I said, since we're doing the online class, I can't just show that in the middle of class without it murdering my video. So we're going to move on to Teddy Roosevelt. Because, as we of course all know, McKinley was forcibly retired, and Teddy Roosevelt took over. Obviously, Theodore Roosevelt was all about imperialism. He believed in using power to secure American economic interests to the point of force if necessary. So there was always this like caveat of, oh, we're only going to send in the Marines if we have to. But again, that's always open to interpretation of when is the point that we have to send in the troops. Mahan, who was apparently a captain, I'm not entirely sure like what his role in the administration was. He had considered a canal across Central America. We had that picture of McKinley considering the Panama Canal. So we're going to talk about the Panama Canal real quick. The U.S. signed the Hay-Pinchot Treaty in 1901 with Britain, which gave America the right to build a canal. So apparently we had to talk to Britain first. I guess because it would have connected the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and that would maybe interfere with British stuff, so we had to make sure they were cool with it. We also then had to buy the land from France because they had already begun a canal project in Panama, but ran out of money 2/5 of the way through because France really isn't good at budgeting. So they sold the land to us for $40 million. There was, however, one other group we needed to talk to, and that was Colombia, the country of Colombia. So they owned the land that would become Panama. So he came to a favorable agreement. But the Colombian government decided that we clearly were really desperate to get this canal built. It was a pain in the butt to have to send the fleet around the southern tip of South America from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and therefore it will be worth a lot to us. So they were going to hold out for more money, which is kind of a dick move, but it's not illegal. It's certainly not really moral. I mean, I wouldn't even say it's not really immoral either. It's scummy, I guess is the best way to put it. It's not great, but it's not illegal. However, in 1903, there was a pro-American uprising in Panama. What a coincidence! So the U.S. of course supported this, and they sent warships in to blockade the port, which prevented Colombia from sending troops in to put the rebellion down. Roosevelt, of course, recognized the new government of Panama because when there's a rebellion, some outside force has to recognize the new government in order for it to become an official government. That's just how foreign relations work. And then Panama signed a treaty that allowed the U.S. to build the canal and exercise power and authority over it. So it took, let's see, when did this all begin? 1901. It took like 12, 13 years to build this canal. It was a process, and there's like multiple documentaries about just the building of the canal. It was a huge thing. I'll get into that in just a minute. Roosevelt went so far as to declare a Roosevelt Corollary on top of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, again, if you guys recall, the Monroe Doctrine is essentially telling the Europeans to stay out of Western Hemisphere business, to stay out of the Caribbean and South American stuff, and we'll leave stuff alone in Europe and Asia. The Roosevelt Corollary, which is essentially Roosevelt saying, I'm going to add on to the Monroe Doctrine, is Roosevelt saying not only will Europe leave Central and South America alone, but America has the right to intervene in any major situations in the Western Hemisphere. Which again, technically was excluding Canada because same people know to leave Canada alone because that's pissing off Britain and nobody wants to bother Britain. But, you know, that's what most people would say. But the Roosevelt Corollary is specifically saying, like, anything going on in Central, South America, the Caribbean, America is going to go in and do what we have to do to make sure it goes the way we want it to go. Also, this pro-American uprising in Panama that happened just after Colombia decided to wait to get a better deal, yeah, there was definitely some backroom dealing going on there. I don't think we've ever gotten any, like, definitive documents describing what went down, but something 100% went down. And the people at the time even were like, something fishy's happening. I've got some images here that kind of go into it as well. Here we have giant, terrifying Teddy Roosevelt coming off of the GOP ship. There's Taft up here too. He's got a shovel. He's got like 1,000 knives. He's got his revolver. And he's got the Roosevelt Doctrine, rather than even the Roosevelt Corollary. He's coming into Panama with the coup d'etat, with Colombia over here being like, you guys can't do that. We technically own Panama. But not anymore, I guess. Here is the one of the theories as to what was going on, where it was France behind it, because France wanted to sell us the land for $40 million, but if Colombia was blocking it, then they couldn't sell us the land. So maybe France got in there and stirred up the whole revolution thing so that they could sell us the land because they needed the money. I don't know. It's a whole thing. And here we have, like, Paul Bunyan, Teddy Roosevelt just digging the canal himself, which he did go there. Get to that in a minute. Panama or bust, precedent, Colombian protests, international law. And then here we have Panama as this baby just being brought along for the ride. Now, I don't know how much of that is the whole, like, infantilizing these Central American powers because they're brown people, and how much of it is Panama just became a country and we're immediately, like, signing a treaty with them to build this canal because that's what we were there for to begin with. Like, we're really using them to get our own gains. So I can see it as just, like, they've been a country for, like, 2 days, and we're already pulling them along in our scheme to get this canal. The man who can make dirt fly, here he is, tossing the people aside that are protesting the canal. Not because people don't want the canal, because the canal is a great idea, but because of the circumstances behind it. Speaking of which, here's Teddy Roosevelt. Also, another weird thing about this time period was the technology. I think this was like a steam-powered like excavator. A lot of them were actually horse-powered. The horses would they would have a horse next to it, like walking on a treadmill, and it would move the gears to make the digger work. It's such a weird period in history. Also, here we have, I don't know what this actually is. I mean, I guess maybe it's moving dirt. You've got the diggers here up on the sides. I mean, look at all the steam. I mean, it is early 1900s all over the place. So, a lot of people died. I can't really express that. A lot of people died building the canal. In a number of ways. Do you know what the number one thing that killed people building this canal was? No, it wasn't dynamite. I mean, that did kill a number of people. But like the number one thing killing people building the canal. No. Again, it certainly killed people, but this picture is a hint. Not by the train. No, they're out in the open. Mm-mm. Think of where they are. Panama. No. The locals wanted them there. Has to do with the climate. disease. Because look at all this standing water. Look at all this nasty, muddy standing water. And that's what they were working in all the time. And Panama is like equatorial. We're like here in South Carolina, we're subtropical, and it's bad enough. This is 365. This is all year long. It is equatorial, it is rainy, it is humid, it is mosquitoes all the time. And I mean, this is worse than Cuba in terms of like dense tropical rainforest. So yeah, they were constantly dropping of every disease out there: malaria, yellow fever, whatever else mosquitoes carry. Just everything. Yeah, it was real bad in terms of just like mosquito-borne illnesses. I think even today, the Panama Canal has like these big sprayers on the side of the canals to like make sure the mosquitoes don't just swarm the boats. Speaking of which, let's see. Here's one of the locks being built, which again, like 1901 technology to build these things, because these had to be watertight. Obviously, they would close up. You'd fill them with water, or drain them of water to equal the next lock. I'll just go ahead and move to this one. So yeah, for example, here you can see the sea level is lower than the lake here. So they come in, the gate would close behind them. They'd fill this with water, and then they'd be able to go to the next area. Now the next area here, as you can see, is a lake. It's not locks all the way along. But then as they get to the next area, they get to the next lock, and it would either fill or lower for the next area. This wasn't as bad as like the Erie Canal in terms of them going like up a damn mountain. Because sometimes they would do that where they go in a lock and it would go up, and then they go in the next lock and it would go up, and they'd actually go up a mountain using the canal. A lot of the Panama Canal is actually like lakes and rivers and stuff, which is very useful. The small part of the canal that was built in the early 1900s is still there, obviously. It's still being used. But they built a larger canal, either to the north or south, where bigger ships can go through. The Suez Canal in Egypt is mostly just a ditch through the middle of the desert, so there's not much you can do with that, which is unfortunate. Okay, on to China. I swear there was something I want to talk about with this, but I can't remember it. So, we pretty much had the Caribbean and Central America more or less under our control. I guess Brazil was too big to really bother. It's a lot of country. So Roosevelt decided that maybe we should go to other parts of the world and stick our nose in and get involved. China was a major target because, well, they've got a big population. And manufacturers want to go to a place that's got a lot of people to sell their crap. Because if you want to sell stuff to people, you need a lot of people. And China's got a lot of people. It's pretty simple math. The U.S. wanted to force an open door policy in China, which had already been forced by most of Europe during the Opium Wars, which is a whole separate thing that we talk about in my European history class, and it's as bad as it sounds. Basically, Britain forced opium into China that was so bad it like crashed their economy, and when they decided to fight back, Britain went in with gunships and crushed them. And then there was a second Opium War for no real reason, and the Europeans just all ganged up on China to force treaty ports where they could have access to the ports to do whatever. Also, extraterritoriality, which means that Chinese law does not apply to European citizens. So they can do whatever the hell they want, and they would have to, if they did a crime in China, they would have to go back home to be punished for it, and that rarely happened. So use your imagination for what that meant. The U.S. sent 2,500 troops in to help quell the nationalist uprising known as the Boxer Rebellion, which was a response to the Opium Wars and also the Sino-Japanese War, where China was attempting to modernize, which is what Japan did. But actually, we'll talk about that next slide. And China failed miserably in that war, and then the European countries forced China to pay them more money because China was just in a really bad spot. And so the Boxers, which were these nationalists, decided that they would overthrow the government and create a new government and push the Europeans out, because clearly the government that was in power was not strong enough to resist essentially the European invaders. So when the Boxer Rebellion happened, the Europeans went in to crush it, and America got involved. So all these European powers and also America were now able to do whatever they wanted to China. And people wonder why China doesn't like us. Also, Russia decided to invade China's province of Manchuria because, well, China was too weak to do anything about it. However, Japan also had decided that Manchuria was theirs and proceeded to beat the brakes off of Russia, to use a term I learned just a few years back. It's always fun. So Russia wanted to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but they didn't want to build it through Siberia because Siberia sucks. And they were like, hey, if we take Manchuria, we can build through Manchuria. Manchuria is much better than, Siberia. And they had Port Arthur, which is a lovely little port that isn't frozen over all year. And Japan rolled into Port Arthur and wiped out the Russian Pacific Fleet in like a week. They then rolled into Manchuria and proceeded to beat the crap out of the Russians, to the extent that Russia almost had its Bolshevik Revolution early, because they were being beaten so badly. Because, again, they didn't have a Trans-Siberian Railroad. And, sorry if online people, you can't see this, but, like, if this is Russia, just here in, like, Moscow, and all the cities are over here, and Japan's over here, and this is all Siberia, there was no railroad. They had to send all their troops through Siberia. Now, there was a Baltic fleet over here. They had to go all the way around. That didn't go so well with the Baltic fleet. If you want to hear about that, look up Tragedy of the Baltic Fleet on YouTube. It's the best probably hour I've ever had in my life. It is horrendous. So Roosevelt decided that he needed to limit Japan's gains, as completely pushing Russia out would cause a, quote, real shifting of equilibrium as far as the white races are concerned. Now granted, most Europeans didn't really like Russia, but they would rather Russia be able to be in the region than, an Asian country. So he called a peace treaty in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Japan was given Korea and parts of Manchuria. Of course, obviously, we didn't bring the Koreans in to ask them about it. But they had to support U.S.'s open door policy. And then Roosevelt, after this diplomatic victory, was like, look how good I do diplomacy. Here's this massive fleet. So he sent 16 battleships around the world in a show of force. This was the Great White Fleet, which was like his big thing. After Roosevelt, we had Taft. He preferred to substitute dollars for bullets, encouraged bankers to invest in the Caribbean and Central America. This was known as dollar diplomacy. and doubled American investments in the region. However, this didn't end America doing what America does. In 1909, American fruit and mining companies installed a sympathetic government in Nicaragua, which caused a rebellion because the people in Nicaragua didn't want a government that was installed by foreign fruit and mining companies, which then resulted in America sending troops there to protect the sympathetic government for the next 25 years. So yeah, we just sort of took over Nicaragua with fruit and mining companies. Yeah. That's why those regions are, I mean, this and later Cold War stuff, is why those regions are so chaotic now and why people are, like, fleeing. Because they've been nothing but chaos for the last 100 years. Just saying. So there's Collier's war in China, despite, like, this obviously, like, Japanese symbology here. Here is this fighting over the corpse of China. You've got America standing in the back like they're not involved, but we are so involved. The Russian bear, obviously. This is Britain, Germany, the two-headed, really like a buzzard for Austria. Italy actually looks cool. That's surprising. Japan as this leopard for France there. Also this one, which is a bit more weird. Again, though, it's like, oh, no, we're not involved. Yeah, sure. Here we have us going against the Chinese barbarians, you know, the people who are fighting for their country, but since they're not us, we're totally the good guys. There again, we have the Dragon's Choice, peace or war. You know, you can have peace and submit to us and be in debt to us for pretty much ever, or, you know, you can have war and protect yourselves. That's what it means. All right, here we go. France, keep it up, Russia, you're winning. And Russia says, well, if this is winning, what will you do to me if I lose? There we have Roosevelt, let us have peace. Again, Roosevelt looking less cartoonish here as a cartoon. There's the Great White Fleet. The Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary, hands off of the Caribbean. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and do the video real quick, and we will be done. So, online people, I will put the link up. I mean, by the time you guys see this. So,